Ethan Carter had always believed that a home was more than a neatly kept facade or an address on a block. It was a personal sanctuary where history, passion, and hard work converged. A decorated military veteran turned classic car restorer and weekend mechanic, Ethan poured his heart into every nut, bolt, and polish he applied. His suburban home, a lovingly maintained mid-century modern gem, was prized not only for its nostalgic architecture, but also for its custom-built garage. This garage wasn't just a shelter for his cherished collection of vintage automobiles. It was a testament to years of meticulous care, a sacred space where memories of his service and family legacy were interwoven with the gleam of chrome and the roar of restored engines. For Ethan, every detail of his property had meaning, from a hand-painted welcome sign at the gate to the artfully landscaped front yard. His home was his statement of independence, a safe haven where he could escape the world's demands and indulge in his creative passions. However, recent months had seen that peace slowly invaded by a force as unwelcome as it was arbitrary: the overzealous meddling of the local homeowners association (HOA). At the helm of this bureaucratic machine was Kerren, a self-appointed arbiter of suburban perfection, with an iron grip on every rule, regulation, and curb appeal guideline. Dressed in crisp pastel suits and armed with clipboards, Kerren and her cadre of like-minded board members had made it their mission to sanitize the community of any unauthorized deviations from their rigid vision of conformity. Their latest offense? Repeatedly parking a gaudy, shiny sedan in the driveway, and inexplicably, even inside Ethan's garage. It started one brisk Saturday morning. Ethan had just finished giving his prized '67 Mustang a fresh coat of enamel when he stepped outside to find Kerren's burgundy sedan idling in his driveway. At first, he assumed it was a mistake, a misplaced rental car perhaps. But when, a week later, he opened his garage door to discover a set of keys on the floor and the unmistakable shape of that same sedan partially inside his sacred space, anger and disbelief welled up inside him. How could the HOA president, of all people, repeatedly trespass on his property? Later that afternoon, while Ethan was carefully reassembling his Mustang's engine, he heard the sound of heels clicking on the driveway. There, standing with an air of smug authority, was Kerren herself. With a practiced smile that did little to hide her condescension, she greeted him. "Ethan Carter," she began, voice clipped and formal, "it appears that once again your property is being misused by unauthorized vehicles. I'm afraid this is a violation of our community's strict guidelines regarding proper use of private driveways and garages." Ethan's gaze hardened. "Kerren, my garage is private property. I work on these cars with blood, sweat, and passion, and I don't appreciate your cronies parking their vehicles here, especially when it happens repeatedly. I didn't authorize your car or any car to be parked on my premises." Her smile never wavered, though her eyes flashed with unspoken irritation. "The HOA has established these rules for the collective benefit of our neighborhood, Ethan. Personal preferences must yield to community standards. I suggest you rectify this immediately, or we will have no choice but to impose the proper fines." The conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving Ethan seething on his porch. As dusk fell and the warm glow of his garage lights filled the space with a nostalgic radiance, Ethan vowed that his cherished sanctuary would not be compromised by Kerren's arbitrary dictates. In that moment, it became clear that this wasn't just about a misplaced car. It was about defending the right to live, create, and restore on one's own terms. And Ethan Carter was ready to fight. The following morning, as Ethan sipped his robust coffee on the back porch, he found an envelope taped to his front door. The envelope bore the embossed logo of the HOA and a stern letter demanding that he cease and desist from violating community standards. The notice cited an obscure clause about improper vehicular use of private property and threatened a fine of $750 if corrective measures weren't taken immediately. Every sentence dripped with legal jargon and an air of inflexible authority, all stamped with Kerren's signature. Ethan's pulse quickened as he read the notice. Though he knew his rights, the letter was a stark reminder of the increasingly invasive control the HOA was exerting over his personal property. Determined to stand his ground, He spent the better part of the morning combing through local zoning laws and property deeds. It became clear that the HOA's demands held little weight when measured against municipal statutes protecting private property rights. By midday, as the sun climbed high over neatly trimmed lawns, a sleek black sedan pulled up to Ethan's driveway. Out stepped two stern-faced inspectors, clipboards in hand, sent by Kerren to assess the situation. They began measuring the driveway's dimensions, checking the condition of the garage door, and scrutinizing every detail with an intensity that made Ethan feel as though he were under a full-scale audit. "Sir," one inspector said, his tone neutral but firm, "our records indicate that your property is being used in a manner that conflicts with community standards. We'll need to note these discrepancies for the board." Ethan, trying to keep his tone calm yet resolute, replied, "I run a private home and workshop here. My garage is for my classic car projects. I don't allow unauthorized vehicles on my property. I'm well within my legal rights." Despite his confident words, a knot of frustration tightened in his chest as the inspectors jotted down every detail. Kerren arrived just as the inspectors were about to leave. Standing with arms folded and a self-assured smile, she addressed Ethan. "Ethan, rules are not suggestions. The HOA expects you to comply with community standards. Should you choose to ignore these guidelines, be prepared for further action." Her voice carried a tone of finality that brooked no argument. Later that afternoon, with the inspectors gone and the fine still looming large on his doorstep, Ethan retreated to his study. Surrounded by his well-worn legal texts and property documents, he began drafting a detailed response. Every paragraph was laced with references to local ordinances and citations of property rights. In his mind, this was not just a fight about a misparked car. It was a stand against an overreaching system determined to micromanage every aspect of life. As word of the incident spread around the neighborhood, a mixture of sympathy and apprehension stirred among his neighbors. While some recalled a time when personal property rights were respected, others, loyal to Kerren's vision of uniformity, whispered that Ethan was simply refusing to play by the rules. Regardless of public opinion, Ethan's resolve only strengthened. He would not allow Kerren or the HOA to trample on the sanctity of his home. That evening, as twilight deepened into a cool, reflective dusk, Ethan paced the length of his driveway. The soft hum of cicadas was in stark contrast to the storm of thoughts in his mind. Each step he took echoed his determination to protect not only his prized garage, but the very essence of his independence. In that quiet moment, with the gentle glow of his car headlights illuminating the driveway, Ethan silently vowed, if Kerren and her cronies insisted on bullying him with fines and intrusive inspections, then he would return the favor in kind. And he was just getting started. In the days that followed the inspector's visit, a palpable tension gripped the neighborhood. Rumors swirled about Ethan's defiance and the increasing audacity of the HOA. What began as a single parking violation had mutated into a full-blown power struggle between an individual defending his rights and a bureaucratic regime determined to enforce its arbitrary standards. Kerren, unwilling to let Ethan's quiet resistance stand, initiated a series of increasingly aggressive actions. Late one afternoon, as Ethan returned from a long day in the workshop, he discovered a new notice taped to his garage door. This time the letter was even more menacing, warning him that any further incidents would result in the immediate towing of unauthorized vehicles, and hinting at the possibility of levying a lien against his property for repeated violations. Anger and disbelief churned within him as he recalled the incident. Kerren's car had been parked in his garage not once, but repeatedly. And now, using this as an excuse to flex the HOA's muscle, she was threatening to escalate matters legally. Determined to document every transgression, Ethan discreetly set up a series of cameras along the perimeter of his property. Over the following days, he recorded every arrival and departure, every time that same burgundy sedan materialized in places it shouldn't be. His investigation soon uncovered a disturbing pattern. Neighbors confided in hushed tones that they, too, had experienced similar overreach, unauthorized fines, unannounced inspections, and even threats of eviction for minor infractions. One sympathetic board member, emboldened by Ethan's steadfast defiance, discreetly tipped him off that Kerren's actions were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern of corruption. It appeared that Kerren was not only fixated on Ethan's garage, but was also using the HOA's authority to intimidate several residents who dared to live outside her prescribed ideal. Armed with this damning information, Ethan began compiling a dossier. He gathered copies of the dubious notices, recorded conversations with other homeowners, and even obtained internal memos that suggested funds were being misappropriated by the board to cover legal fees for Kerren's latest schemes. Every new piece of evidence added fuel to his determination to expose the abuse of power at the heart of the HOA. At the next scheduled HOA meeting, packed with anxious homeowners, a visibly irate Kerren, and several board members whose confidence was beginning to waver, Ethan stepped up to the podium. With a steady voice and a folder bursting with evidence in hand, he laid out a clear and damning narrative. He detailed every instance of unauthorized parking on his property, every unfair fine, and every extra-legal action that had been taken in his name. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his tone calm but unwavering. What I'm presenting today is not simply about a car parked in my garage. It is about the systematic abuse of power that has become the norm in our community. We all deserve to live in a neighborhood where property rights are respected, not trampled upon by arbitrary rules and personal vendettas. Murmurs rippled through the room as Ethan's evidence was projected onto a screen. Photographs, video clips of the burgundy sedan creeping into his garage, copies of the threatening notices, and internal documents, all painted a picture of an HOA that had strayed far beyond its remit. Even some of the staunchest supporters of Kerren found themselves shifting uncomfortably in their seats as the undeniable proof of corruption and overreach was laid bare. Kerren's retort was measured but laced with desperation. "These are isolated incidents," she insisted. "I am merely enforcing the rules to protect the integrity of our community. You, Mr. Carter, have chosen to disregard the standards that all of us have agreed to abide by." But as Ethan methodically presented his case, it became clear that the balance of power was beginning to shift. Several board members exchanged furtive glances, and even a few longtime residents voiced their doubts about the fairness of Kerren's tactics. In that charged atmosphere, what had begun as a personal grievance evolved into a collective call for transparency, accountability, and the restoration of true community values. As the meeting adjourned in a murmur of discontent and uncertain hope, Ethan felt a surge of cautious optimism. He knew that his battle was far from over, but with every piece of evidence and every whispered conversation among his neighbors, the seeds of change were taking root. The HOA's unchecked authority was being questioned, and soon the full force of the law might be brought to bear on those who had abused it for far too long. In a dramatic twist that left the neighborhood reeling, Kerren's next move pushed the conflict into dangerous new territory. Early one foggy morning, as Ethan prepared to open the garage for his routine work on a vintage engine, he was confronted with an impossible sight. Kerren's burgundy sedan, again, was parked inside his garage. This time, however, it wasn't a simple case of misdirected parking. The vehicle was wedged so deeply that it prevented him from accessing his prize car collection. Raging yet resolute, Ethan immediately contacted the local towing service he had trusted for years. "This is no longer a matter of inconvenience," he declared. "It's a flagrant violation of my property rights." The tow truck arrived with a sense of urgency befitting a military operation. As the driver hooked the sedan to the tow truck, Ethan watched with a mix of satisfaction and defiance. In that charged moment, he felt a surge of poetic justice. The very symbol of Kerren's repeated intrusion was being removed, sent, as he later put it, to a junkyard where entitlement goes to rust. Yet Kerren wasn't finished. That very afternoon, as Ethan prepared for the next HOA meeting, a new crisis emerged. The power to his home was abruptly cut off, a maintenance issue, according to a terse notice posted on his door. It seemed that Kerren and her cronies had decided to escalate their campaign of intimidation to a whole new level by tampering with utilities. At the meeting, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Ethan arrived carrying a folder bursting with evidence. Receipts for the tow, surveillance footage capturing the unauthorized parking, and documentation of a utility cut off. When he took the stage, the room fell silent. With deliberate clarity, he recounted the string of abuses, each act a deliberate assault on his rights as a homeowner. "Today, I'm not just speaking for myself," Ethan declared, his voice resonant and clear, "but for every resident who has ever been bullied by an overreaching HOA. We deserve dignity, respect, and above all, the right to live on our own property without fear of arbitrary fines, intrusive inspections, or even power outages." As he spoke, the evidence flickered across the projector screen. Images of the tow truck hauling off Kerren's sedan, time-stamped footage of the car's repeated intrusions, and even a copy of the utility disconnection notice. A murmur of approval rippled through the audience, and several neighbors exchanged determined looks. Kerren attempted to interject with her standard spiel, complaining about maintaining community order and protecting property values, but her words were drowned out by the growing chorus of dissent. Board members, once unflinching in their loyalty, now appeared conflicted as Ethan's clear-cut evidence left little room for doubt. As the meeting drew to a close, Ethan's declaration had ignited a spark of rebellion throughout the community. The very act of towing Kerren's car, executed with calm precision and in direct response to her repeated trespasses, had become a symbol of resistance against a system that had grown corrupt. With every neighbor who nodded in agreement and every whispered, "Finally," Ethan felt the scales of justice beginning to tip in his favor. Outside the town hall, as residents congregated in small clusters discussing the events of the day, a palpable sense of liberation took hold. It was as though Kerren's latest overstep had shattered the illusion of order that the HOA had long enforced. In that moment, Ethan Carter wasn't just a frustrated homeowner. He was a leader of a quiet revolution, a man determined to reclaim his space and his dignity, one unauthorized parking incident at a time. And so, as Kerren fumed silently on the sidelines, unable to counter the overwhelming evidence and the rising tide of neighborly solidarity, Ethan's act of defiance set the stage for what was to come, a battle that would see not only the rollback of unjust rules, but also the eventual dismantling of an HOA that had long forgotten its original purpose. Cornered and desperate, Kerren decided to pull one final stunt in an attempt to salvage her authority over the community. In the wake of Ethan's bold display at the HOA meeting, she resolved to involve the local police, hoping that the power of law enforcement would force Ethan to submit to her demands. Late one evening, Kerren made a call to the precinct, reporting that Ethan's rampant disregard for community standards was causing a public disturbance. She fabricated claims that his unauthorized vehicle parking had created hazards not only on his property, but also for neighboring driveways. When officers arrived at Ethan's home, he calmly greeted them, presenting copies of local ordinances and his documented evidence. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he explained, showing them the tow receipts and surveillance clips. The officers, reviewing his documentation, quickly concluded that no crime had been committed, and that Kerren's report was baseless. Frustrated, they informed Kerren that her actions could be considered an abuse of power if repeated. Yet Kerren wasn't finished. In a last-ditch effort to undermine Ethan, she secretly arranged for a private investigator, someone she trusted, to tail him and dig up any possible misstep he might have made. But Ethan, ever vigilant, had already upgraded his security cameras and installed hidden recorders around his property. It wasn't long before the investigator was caught red-handed creeping around the garage late at night. The incriminating footage, time-stamped and crystal clear, showed the investigator attempting to hack into Ethan's personal files. At the next HOA meeting, now more packed than ever with outraged homeowners, Ethan presented the final nail in Kerren's coffin. He played the footage in its entirety. The room erupted with shock and indignation as Kerren's desperate bid for vengeance was exposed for all to see. Her attempts to deflect blame and call for stricter regulations were now undermined by her own illegal maneuvers. Today, Ethan declared to the stunned assembly, "We have seen just how far some will go to preserve a power that has no place here. This isn't about a car parked in my garage anymore. It's about standing up against tyranny, whether it comes in the form of arbitrary fines or outright trespassing on my property. The evidence was irrefutable. Kerren's face, flushed with anger and humiliation, told the story of a woman who had lost control. Even those who had once defended her rigid enforcement of rules began to question the legitimacy of her actions. A palpable murmur of approval swept through the room, as Ethan's final act of exposing her duplicity became the rallying cry for change. Outside the meeting, as neighbors discussed the day's events with animated determination, it was clear that Kerren's final desperate move had sealed her fate. Ethan's calm, methodical presentation of the facts and his refusal to be cowed had united the community in a common cause: the right to live free from arbitrary oppression. In that charged atmosphere of vindication, Kerren's facade of authority crumbled further, her reputation now irreparably tarnished by her own underhanded tactics. As the meeting adjourned, Ethan felt both exhaustion and exhilaration. He knew that the battle was far from over, but the tide was unmistakably turning. The very act of exposing Kerren's misdeeds had not only vindicated his own position, but had set in motion a chain reaction that promised to upend the entire corrupt structure of the HOA. In the wake of Kerren's public exposure, the community's collective outrage transformed into decisive action. Over the following weeks, whispers turned into protests, and protests into organized meetings. Homeowners, emboldened by Ethan's courage, began to demand accountability from an HOA that had long operated under a veneer of respectability. At an emergency town hall, a record turnout of residents, many clutching copies of Ethan's evidence, confronted the board. Heated arguments ensued. Long-suffering members recounted their own experiences of arbitrary fines, surprise inspections, and invasive overreach. A once unified board now split along ideological lines. A few members, horrified by Kerren's methods, sided with Ethan. The remaining loyalists clung desperately to outdated protocols and half-truths. In a dramatic vote that felt more like a rebellion than a routine meeting, the homeowners decreed that Kerren be immediately removed from her position as HOA president. The vote was overwhelming, as Kerren was forced to step down in front of a sea of approving faces. Her attempts to salvage control dissolved into bitter silence. Her personal assets, once bolstered by a network of cronies and unquestioning support, began to unravel. Rumors spread quickly that her residence was to be foreclosed, and several board members found themselves facing investigations for misusing HOA funds. For Ethan, this was not merely a personal victory. It was a watershed moment for the entire community. Neighbors who had once lived in fear of arbitrary fines now dared to envision a neighborhood where property rights and individual liberties were respected. In local news reports, the story of Kerren's tyrannical reign and subsequent downfall became a rallying cry for reform. Social media exploded with hashtags celebrating the garage justice that had finally reigned in a decades-long abuse of power. As legal proceedings advanced, the city stepped in. An investigation into the HOA's practices was launched, resulting in significant fines and even criminal charges for some of the board members who had colluded with Kerren. Ethan was called upon as a key witness, his painstakingly gathered evidence serving as the cornerstone of the case against the corrupt administration. At a celebratory community gathering held on a crisp autumn evening, neighbors toasted not only the downfall of a despotic leader, but the rebirth of their collective autonomy. Ethan, ever the modest hero, was praised for his persistence and his unwavering commitment to defending his rights. With a quiet smile and a nod to every homeowner who had taken a stand, he acknowledged that this victory belonged to them all. The oppressive era of Kerren's arbitrary rules was over, replaced by a new chapter defined by transparency, accountability, and mutual respect. In the weeks following the explosive town hall, the full legal weight of the community's rebellion began to take effect. The city, alarmed by the breadth of the HOA's abuses, initiated a thorough audit of its operations. Detailed inspections and forensic accounting revealed a litany of irregularities, misappropriated funds, fraudulent fines, and unauthorized rule changes that had no legal standing. As lawsuits piled up, filed by homeowners tired of being bullied, the once mighty HOA found itself on the defensive. A class action suit, spearheaded by Ethan and supported by scores of affected residents, forced the board to settle out of court for a substantial sum. More damning still, several board members were indicted for their roles in the corruption, and the state's attorney general announced plans to dissolve the HOA entirely. At a follow-up meeting, now less an assembly of power and more a forum for rebuilding community trust, Ethan unveiled his final power move. With a steady voice, he detailed the terms of a new, democratically elected neighborhood council designed to replace the old regime. The city's legal intervention, combined with the overwhelming public support, ensured that the corrupt practices would never again be tolerated. With the legal noose tightening around her, Kerren's personal world began to collapse. Stripped of her position, she was forced to relinquish her home, a stately property once befitting her delusions of grandeur, to settle mounting debts and legal fees. Former allies distanced themselves. Whispers of betrayal followed her every step. Even her husband, once a silent partner in her schemes, publicly disassociated himself amid the scandal. Kerren's final public appearance was a crumbling shadow of the imperious figure she once was. At a hastily arranged meeting with prospective employers in the realm of property management, her credentials and reputation were met with icy stares and polite refusals. The community's disdain was palpable. Everywhere she went, a quiet chorus of good riddance seemed to echo in the background. Ethan, now regarded as the reluctant champion of neighborhood justice, observed Kerren's downfall with a mix of sympathy and relief. There was no gloating in his eyes, only the quiet satisfaction that came from seeing arrogance and abuse of power finally punished by the rule of law. For many, her personal ruin became a cautionary tale, that those who trample on the rights of others will ultimately pay the price. Autumn gave way to winter, and the neighborhood slowly reclaimed the spirit of community that had long been stifled. Ethan Carter's home, once a battleground, now stood as a symbol of resilience and personal freedom. The garage, his cherished workshop, had been restored to its former glory, free from the intrusion of unwanted vehicles and arbitrary rules. At a relaxed block party held on a chilly evening, neighbors gathered to celebrate the new era. Laughter mingled with the sound of holiday music, and for a brief moment, the scars of past battles were replaced by a shared sense of hope and renewal. Over mugs of hot cider and plates of homemade treats, the residents recounted the saga of garage justice with a blend of humor and triumph. In a final light-hearted twist, as Ethan sat back on his porch with a satisfied grin, a neighbor stepped forward holding an oversized, mock HOA violation notice, this time accusing him of being too damn free. Ethan chuckled and replied, "I guess rules really can't hold us down." The screen of his memories and the neighborhood's collective heart faded into a warm, enduring glow. In that gentle moment of poetic justice, it was clear that tyranny had been defeated not by brute force, but by the unwavering spirit of a community united by common cause. Fade to black.